All right, so let's talk about WCAG. 2.2 and 3.0, these are the latest versions that the WTC has been working on. And I would like to talk to you all about what's happening there. Real quick about myself. My name is Wilco Fiers. I work for Deque Europe. I'm the product owner of X Core and X Linter. Additionally, I am the project manager of WCAG 3 on behalf of the W3C, and I'm the facilitator of the ACT task force, the Accessibility Conformance Testing Task Force. Just a little heads up, I have adjusted my slides a little bit. If you're following along on the slide deck, I needed to make some space for something important that I wanted to say at the end of this talk. With that, let's get right into it. So a little bit about today's session. I'll briefly go over the WCAG timeline just to give everybody kind of some context, and then we'll get into what is new in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.2, what criteria they are, how to test them, and there'll be a little bit question time in the middle of the session. So if you have any questions related to WCAG 2.2, ask them right away. We'll have a couple minutes for that. Then we'll move over to WCAG 3.0. We'll talk about the new structure. We'll do some speculation on what we might be seeing in upcoming versions of that. And we'll have questions and wrap up at the end. So there we have it. WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 1.0 came out in 1999. It was worked on for 2 years before completion. And then it pretty quickly after that, 2001, work on WCAG 2.0 started. That lasted until 2008, so 7 years to completion. And you'll see that's a substantial jump in how much time it took. WCAG 2.1 then started development in 2017. It was completed in 2018, so that's a 1-year turnaround. And then for WCAG 2.2, which we're currently working on, that work started in 2020, and it is expected to be completed before the end of the year. We don't have a date yet. We were kind of hoping to have it done sooner, but we're making good progress, and it is almost certainly will be done before the end of the year. Then for 3.0, WCAG 3.0, the research began for that in 2016. So that's a good while ago at this point. And then the first draft of it went to the public last year, 2021. So that's a little context and just give you some overview of how long some of these things have taken. So you'll see as time progresses, the time it takes to develop these things goes up a bit, which is relevant for WCAG 3.0. We'll get to that in a little while. But first, let's start off with what's coming in WCAG 2.2. And I just want to give everybody heads up. It's going to get a little bit complicated, so strap in. So the new success criteria for guideline 2 for navigable are focus appearance minimum and focus appearance enhanced. And then there is page break navigation. For guideline 2.5 input modality, there's dragging movement and target size minimum. Guideline 3.2 has had 2 new success criteria: consistent help and visible controls. For guideline 3.3 input assistance, there's accessible authentication and accessible authentication, no exceptions. And lastly, there is redundant entry. So that's a good number of new success criteria coming out in WCAG 2.2. These aren't completely finalized. Like I said, we're still working on some of these, but expect most, if not all of these, to come out in WCAG 2.2 once we are ready to go. So we'll dive right in, and we'll start off by looking at easily the most complicated one that has been added to WCAG so far. It is 2.4.11. When user interface components receive keyword focus, an area indicator meets the following. Minimum area, the area is either at least as large as an area of a 1 CSS pixel perimeter, or at least as large as a 4 CSS thick line around the shortest edge. That's a good bit of work. We'll get in a little bit more detail. We'll look at that, what that exactly means. Contrast, the area has a contrast ratio of 3:1. And then there's an adjacent contrast requirement as well, which says that the contrasting error ratio has to be 3:1 against the component. So not just the background, but the component, or it has to be 2 CSS pixels thick. And then there is an additional requirement which may or may not be pulled into a separate success criteria, and that is yet to be decided, which is that when a component becomes focused, the focus indicator must be visible. So who does this help? This is particularly useful for keyboard users. If you're navigating with the keyboard, with a switch device, with voice input, you're relying on focus to know where on the page your interaction is. And this is especially useful for low vision keyboard users who may struggle a little bit more with the visuals on their page. Getting into the first item, which is the area of the component. So we want the focus indicator of a control to be either 1 CSS pixel thick perimeter. So if you have a button, or like on my screen is a rounded button where you, as long as you draw a 1 CSS pixel thick border around that button as a focus indicator, you're good. That's fine. That is the easiest way to pass this requirement. Just draw a thing around the thing that has focus. Done. If you're gonna get more complicated, Deque loves to do this. If you're familiar with Deque products, you'll see wacky, interesting focus indicators all over the place. And that's where the second bullet comes in. The focus indicator needs to be at least as large as an area of 4 CSS pixels on the shortest side of the minimum bounding box. On my screen is an example button. It's a blue button which has a yellow focus indicator on the left side of the button. That focus indicator, which sits on the shortest side of the button, has to be 4 CSS pixels thick. It can at no point be thinner than 2 CSS pixels to ensure that there is sufficient area there to see. So this really helps ensure that people can see what's going on with this focus. The second bullet relates to the contrast ratio between the focused and the unfocused state of the component. When a component is focused, the contrast difference needs to be at least 3:1. On my screen, there are some buttons, a row of buttons. These are black buttons. It would be insufficient for a black button to have a dark gray background change as your focus indicator. But if you change the background from black to white, that is more than enough. You'll get a 12:1, I think, contrast ratio. That's fine. Also worth noting, your focus indicator doesn't need to be entirely meet that 3:1 contrast ratio. If you have something like a thick shadow around your button to indicate the position of the focus, there needs to be some minimum area, and that was defined in the previous section, what that area is that needs to have a 3:1 contrast ratio. It's fine for some other parts of that focus indicator not to have that, as long as there is a sufficiently large area of the focus indicator that has enough contrast. Then we're looking at the adjacent contrast bullet of the success criterion. That essentially means when you have your focus indicator, if it's a thin focus indicator, that focus indicator needs to have sufficient contrast with the surroundings. On my screen, there are a number of blue buttons which contrast really well with a yellow outline that's drawn on top of that. That works fine if that's a 1 pixel outline. But if you have an outline that is the same color or a very similar color to the button, you can imagine a black button with a black focus indicator. If that's a 1 pixel focus indicator, gives the appearance that the button is just slightly larger than it was before, which is hard to detect. So you need to have a focus indicator that's at least 2 CSS pixels thick to give enough of a size difference to be noticeable. Then lastly, on this, the item that is focused is not entirely hidden by author-created content. Essentially, what that means is when a component receives focus, it can't be hidden. Make sure that the thing is visible. When you see this often with sticky headers, if you navigate in reverse order on a page, buttons may be hidden because there's sticky banners above or below. So this is a problem, and do keep an eye out for that as well. So how do we test this thing? It's a fairly complicated success criterion, but testing it is not quite as difficult. So in step 1, we just want to go from the top of the page, navigating to each element using the tab. We'll fail any element that is fully obscured or that has very bad contrast or on the focus indicator or no focus indicator at all. And we'll just make a note of all the elements that don't have that have a small focus indicator, that have questionable contrast. We'll put those aside for now. And then in step 2, we'll want to do the reverse. We'll start at the bottom of the page, shift tab through all the way to the top and see if any elements are obscured. In step 3, we'll take those notable elements with questionable contrast. We'll want to use the browser's inspect tool to figure out the size. You can use a color picker to figure out the contrast difference between the foreground, between the focused and unfocused states. And you need to use a screenshot to get out the exact dimensions of the focus indicator. There are situations where this can get complicated, but usually a focus indicator that just goes around, that has sufficient contrast, passes. So 95% of the time you can eyeball this success criterion. Deque is working on tools. I'm sure others are too. DevTools Pro will likely have a tool in the keyboard tool, which can do this completely automatically. So there's a good chance that we'll just be able to use tools to test this success criterion. So that was the complicated one. Don't worry, gets a little easier from here. Let's move right on to page break. So for web content with page break locators, and this is a new concept, page break locator, a mechanism is available to navigate to each locator. So page break location, page break locator is a programmatically determined destination marker that are arranged in a meaningful sequence to represent a locator serving the same purpose as a page break in printed documents. That's complicated. Don't worry too much about it. What that means is role doc page break. This is a technology that comes from EPUB, and usually this success criterion is mostly relevant to. I muted myself. Who this is for? This is most useful for people using ebooks as an alternative to physical books. For example, students in a classroom who use a tablet for screen magnification. That if a teacher says go to page 10, you need to know where page 10 is. And this success criterion says that the document needs to provide a mechanism. So how do you test this? When you're testing EPUBs, look for a list of pages, either in whatever user agent you're using. That can be a browser, it can be an EPUB reader, or it can be in the document itself. One of those things has to be true. Dragging movement is the next success criterion, 257. All functionality that uses a dragging movement for operation can be achieved by a single pointer without dragging, unless dragging is essential. This is common, for example, in maps where you can drag around the map by holding and moving. What you want there is for there to be buttons on the screen that help a user navigate around. So arrow key accessibility is not sufficient here. You need those on-screen buttons to do that. A similar thing is in Kanban boards where you have cards that move around. They can be moved around by dragging them. You want some kind of controller button that lets you move those around. This is particularly useful for people with mobility impairments. And the way to test this is just by looking for drag and drop mechanisms and to check if there is some way to do it by mouse clicking through the user interface. Target size is the success criterion says the size of the target of a pointer input is at least 24 by 24 CSS pixels. So a button needs to be 24 by 24 pixels. Except where the size, where the offset is 24 CSS pixels to every adjacent target, except where the target is inline, so like a block of text or in a sentence, or where the presentation is essential. For example, if you have a map where the target size is the size of a village or a town, it's determined by the real size of the village or town, that's a reasonable exception for that. This is, again, particularly useful for people with mobility impairments who may have difficulties hitting small targets. And unlike the current success criterion, 255 target size, which is a AAA success criterion, this criterion focuses not on not accidentally activating the wrong control, rather than activating the right one. That's kind of where that spacing comes in. So the way to think of that, if you have a 24 by 24 pixel icons, you're good, nothing to do there. But if those icons are 20 pixels across, you need to have at least 4 pixel spacing between the icons. The way to test this is you could be using tools. Xcore 4.5 is going to have a rule that checks for this. You can also just use the browser inspect tool where you can look at the size and margin of a component. That is a reasonably reliable way to check these elements. And if all else fails, like you might have a complicated canvas-based application, the screenshots will do. That's not ideal, so we do hope to use tools for most of this. Consistent help means that help mechanisms that are available on one page must be available on the same location in other pages. So this relates to contact details, to contact mechanisms, to self-helps. This can be fully automatic help mechanisms or human help mechanisms, anything like that. And this helps a lot of people. The value of this is people with disabilities often will experience more difficulties filling out forms. So making sure that the help mechanisms that are available or easy to find is really useful. So how to test, you find all help mechanisms, including links to help pages, to contact details, chat functions, that kind of thing. And then you check that if that mechanism is also linked on another page, that it's in the same relative location that it was on the previous page. So it doesn't require that every page has a help mechanism, but it does require that if you reference it, if you use it, that you put that link or information in the same place. Visible controls, 327. When user interface components are invisible until hover or focus makes them visible, provide a visible indicator that the components are available. And then there are a number of exceptions to that. This is particularly useful for people with memory issues. If you have to learn a user interface over and over again, there's hidden controls that puts a significant additional strain on people. So the way to test for this is you start off by finding those hidden controls. You hover and you focus until you find those controls. You look for any visual indicators that those controls exist on that place in the page. So you want some kind of visual cue that there's a hidden control available at that point in the user interface so that people can find it. And then if that doesn't exist, you check if any of those exceptions apply. Moving on to accessible authentication. For each step in the authentication process that relies on a cognitive function test, at least one other authentication method is available that does not rely on the cognitive function test. And a cognitive function test, you can think of something like do a calculation. How much is 3 times 5 is a cognitive function test, but there's CAPTCHAs are also considered a kind of cognitive functional test. There's one exception to this, which is recognizing common objects. Point me to the 3 images that have this bus on it is an exception that was applied to this success criterion, as this is a very, very common pattern in security that a lot of organizations do rely on. This helps, the success criterion helps of people with a variety of cognitive abilities. And the way to check for this is to look for those methods in authentication and find ways to get around that, or find any help mechanisms that might be available. If there's a help mechanism available for people to authenticate, that works too. There's a AAA success criterion that goes along with it, which does not have any exceptions. That's 338. And then the last one in our list is redundant entry. Information previously entered by or provided to the user that is required to be entered again in the same process is either auto-populated or available for the user to select. Essentially, if you have a process, don't ask the same thing twice, unless there's some security reason or it's truly essential. We don't want people to fill out the same information more than once, because this can create, especially for people with certain cognitive limitations, finding this is the same information, recalling information, looking it up multiple times adds a good deal of cognitive load to something that's often already fairly complicated. How to test for this? Find a process that asks for information more than once, and then check if that information can be auto-filled. I'm going to pause here and I'm do a quick time check. I think I can do 2-3 minutes of questions, Laura.
Great. I'm going to dive in because we have a ton. So one of the questions asks, one of the 2.4.11 focus appearance examples looks to use box shadow. The example is also in the WCAG docs. Is this an issue with Windows high contrast mode?
That's a good, I don't think I know the answer to that. As very often is the case, it's going to depend on how that box is implemented. It might be, that is a good thing to look at. I do not think WCAG requires that. And I would encourage that the person who suggested this might raise an issue with WCAG as feedback related to this, because I don't think I've seen this question come up. It's a very good one.
And on the same topic of 2.4.11, can the borders be dashed or dotted?
They can be, provided there's enough area to them. So if you have a thick border that is dashed or dots, as long as the area is sufficient and the contrast is sufficient, that can work just fine.
Cool. On the same topic, should the focus indicator always be measured in pixels rather than EM/REM?
So EM is a relative unit that varies based on the page. WCAG uses CSS pixels. You can absolutely define outlines using EM or REM or other units. That's not a problem. Right? They're just measured in CSS pixels as that standard unit across web content. And you can easily convert between them. So something that is a certain EM value will also be a certain CSS pixel value.
Okay, and then I think we have time for one more.
Yes.
24 pixels for a target size seems small when using a finger for input. Is there other rules for touch devices?
The AAA success criterion that went into WCAG 2.2 is 44 by 44. That is absolutely the best idea to go with. We do have to realize that web content is very broad and it is applied on lots and lots of different websites. Standard buttons, standard line height. It's often a really good idea to stick with the 44 pixel, but there are too many exceptions where it just doesn't work, where it just doesn't quite fit in, where it means not enough controls can fit into the user interface. And space is also constrained. It kind of constrains with just regular text size and with what you might want for smaller devices. You do need a certain density on your information when you have smaller screens. That's important for low vision users. So there's somewhat of a tension, and this is kind of the minimum we came to that still brings value to people that struggle with these difficulties.
Awesome. There's a ton more, but I'll let you keep rolling.
I bet. And please feel free to reach out to me separately or to reach out to the WCAG working group about any questions you additionally have. And maybe we'll have a little time for them at the end, but I'm thinking 3 hour questions are coming up too. All right. So let's get into WCAG 3.0. This one is called the W3C Accessibility Guidelines, not the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I thought was kind of neat. The acronym stays the same, but the name is slightly changed. So the goals of WCAG 3.0, we've learned a lot from WCAG 2, and there are some areas that we found we're having difficulties with, which required a fresh start and a fresh look. And so the key areas we came to that we wanted to start addressing for 3.0 is we want to make WCAG 3.0 easier to learn. I'll point you back to the 2.2 conversation I just had. It gets pretty complicated. There's some areas that need to be improved. We also want to have a broader support for disability needs. There are people whose needs are currently not addressed by WCAG 2. And that just because of the way WCAG 2 was structured, we're having a very hard time addressing that. And since WCAG 2 is effectively the standard for accessibility, it's really hard for people to get their needs even looked at if they're not already covered by WCAG 2. So we want to address that in WCAG 3. Additionally, we want to do a better job of keeping up with new technologies, and we want to better reflect real world accessibility. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in a sec. As for WCAG 3 structure, the way we're currently looking at it, WCAG 3 will no longer have principles, guidelines. It is a guidelines document, so guidelines stay the same as guidelines stay there, but WCAG is shifting over from success criteria to outcomes. And there's a subtle difference there, but the difference is important in that what matters is the end result. What does this thing mean for a person using my website? What does this person need? what needs to be accomplished. And then techniques have been transformed into methods, and methods are more encompassing. Then the techniques are, they're broader, they're bigger, they're more prescriptive, they're more of a tutorial as well. Fairly new is the concept of critical errors. WCAG 3, what we don't want is a standard that's an all or nothing thing. WCAG 3 introduces the idea of this stuff is critical. You cannot have any of these. These things are non-critical. You can have some as long as you keep it to a minimum. It's tolerable. So there's a distinction, and this is sort of, it's slightly similar to the non-interference requirements that exist in WCAG 2, which says certain errors are not allowed, not even on things that have conforming alternative versions. Another change to WCAG 3 is that the conformance levels will be renamed from AA, AAA to bronze, silver, gold, as those concepts are just slightly better known and understood across cultures. An example of an outcome here is heading organized content. Organize content into logical blocks with headings relevant to the subsequent content. This makes locating and navigating information easier and faster. It's in one sense, this outcome is more specific than WCAG 2. If you think back of WCAG 2, what it has in headings, it has the info and relationships, which kind of bundles the heading requirement with tons of other things that are related to relationships. This pulls it out, puts it into its own thing. And then there's a critical error, which you can add of any of one or more headings necessary to locate the content needed to complete a process are missing. So if that's the case, if critical headings are missing, you do not meet anything at all. So these are not allowed, but some missing headings may be allowed. And the way that's expressed in WCAG 3 today is through a rating. The rating is sort of an exploratory thing that we're looking at. We know we want something like this in WCAG 3, whether or not it'll be a rating or some other mechanism, it's yet to be decided, but this is an example of how that might look. So there's a rating from 0 to 4, with a rating of 0 means you have 25% or less of the expected headings are present, or there is a critical error. So if any critical errors, rating is 0. Then it goes up. For rating 1 is 25 to 50%, rating 2 is 50 to 80, 3 is 80 to 95, and 4 is 95 to 100. So you can see how through that imperfections may be allowed. The target for this is to have an average rating of 3.5. So it does set the bar reasonably high. It creates a scale that you can apply so you can see how well your organization might be doing in terms of its headings. And there is some room above the minimum as well. So there's a conformance requirement of 3.5, but there's some room to grow as well beyond that. So that's currently in the draft. I'm going to go now into speculation on what's coming up. These are all concepts that have been discussed in the working group that's working on WCAG 3, but none of this has made it into draft. So we may or may not see some of these things come up in the next or the draft after. But this is where I think it gets especially interesting. So some of the new features that have been talked about for WCAG 3, conformance for websites and apps. WCAG 2 conformance model only works for individual pages. But we're all building websites and apps. We're not writing individual pages. So how do I say anything about the conformance of my app? We want to address that in WCAG 3. We want to look at new technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality. We may be having separate requirements for third-party content. So if you are Gmail and you're presenting somebody else's email, which you had nothing to do with writing, what are the things you need to do to make sure that's still reasonably accessible, even though you didn't write any of the content? That's something you might see in third-party requirements. There might be sampling, scoring, metrics, and we are looking at new methods of testing. One of the reasons that we're struggling with these additional disability needs is because of the way WCAG 2 is currently being tested. We're exploring different ways of testing. And I'll have one example of that in a minute. One of the things that are likely going to make it into WCAG 3's next draft is status levels. We will, for each section in WCAG 3, indicate how far along we think it is. So this is just while we're writing, we're going to indicate to you how much progress have we made on this, how far do we think it is, so that you're going to have an easier time assessing, should I be using this? How serious should I be taking this? And there are 5 levels in that. There's placeholder, which is temporary stuff. This going to be hidden by default. Much of WCAG 3 is currently in the placeholder stage. We know something needs to go there. We don't know what to put there yet. There's exploratory, which is very early work. Some of WCAG 3 is there. All of WCAG 3 is currently either in the placeholder or the exploratory phase, just to give you an indication of how far along we are. We are in the early stages still. And that content is going to be hidden by default. We are probably going to show some of the things that we've been working on to get feedback on that, but the things that we don't think is ready for feedback are going to be hidden. And there's the developing stage, which is promising work, but details need to be peeled out. There's refinement work. This is work we think is largely there, but needs a lot of public scrutiny. And then there's the mature status level, which will show that once it's at this stage, we think it's ready. We think it can be used. That doesn't mean it won't change, but we think it's unlikely it will. There might be user agent methods, which is going to indicate which is new in WCAG 3, which will be a way for browsers and assistive technologies to satisfy an outcome. So right now, WCAG 2 is all about content authors. It is content authors must do X, Y, Z. WCAG 3 may be shifting away from that model a little bit by providing ways that browsers and assistive technologies can solve certain problems. Machine learning developing the way it is, we expect a good deal of things to start getting solved. An example of that is language detection. Language detection is getting really good, and there may very well be a time where content authors no longer need to indicate the language of things because the user agents and assistive technology have gotten good enough. So that's what we mean with a user agent method. It's a way that user agents can solve problems that currently content authors may need to solve. Recognizing text and images is another example of that. The technology does already exist. It just needs to get a little better. And suppressing content flashing is another one. Browsers might be able to do that. It might be a feature that you need to enable, but if browsers can do that, content authors may not need to work on this so much anymore. Protocols is going to be is an idea of what this new testing may look like. And protocol is essentially guidance that sits outside of WCAG. So it wouldn't be part of the WCAG guidance itself. It's things that you can adopt for your website that you can incorporate into the WCAG conformance model, but it isn't essentially part of WCAG. There are reasons for that. For example, guidance might be used to include things that are difficult to test consistently, such as task completion tests, set to users to see if they can complete a particular task. That's a thing WCAG might never be able to incorporate, but we can include protocols externally, and you can report that you've done this kind of testing. It might also be used for non-universal guidelines, such as accessibility needs for children. If you build your web content to work for kids with disability needs, that might require some additional things, and you may want to report on how you've done that. Niche technologies is another one. If you're building an application specifically to run on touchscreen ticketing machines, you may have some additional accessibility requirements that don't apply to the general web, and protocols is a way that you can incorporate that. There's some real examples of that today. Plainlanguage.gov is an example of that they provide guidelines. You can find them on plainlanguage.gov/guidelines. There's just like content usable for cognitive, which you can find on w3.org/tr/coga-usable. And the way these become testable and part of WCAG could be through metadata or accessibility statements. So if you included metadata that showed that you've done this kind of testing, that you've ensured you followed the plain language guidelines, or that have ensured that you followed the content usable guidelines, you might be able to include metadata that can be surfaced by a user's browser, which can help them understand whether or not that site's going to work well for them. I'm running out of time, which is funny for the timeline problem. WCAG 3.0 might be done at the earliest by 2028. There is a lot of work ahead of us. And 2028 is a long time to wait for a next version of WCAG 3.0. So we do want to find a way to deliver something earlier. The working group is very aware of the need of providing and solving some of these problems. And waiting 6 years, a decade, is just too long. So we are looking at some options for that. That might include either delivering a smaller version of WCAG 3 and updating to 3.1 later. It might mean a transitional document that can be published in a few years and then have 3.0 published a number of years later, or it might mean breaking WCAG 3.0 up into modules in a similar way that CSS is published in modules, if you're familiar with that. So it's multiple documents that all make up WCAG 3, and that could be published one after the other. These ideas are currently being discussed, and I hope to have an answer to what direction the working group is going to take within a few months or so. And lastly, I want to invite everybody to get involved. You can review the latest draft on w3.org/tr/WCAG-3.0. And you can leave comments and open issues on github.com/w3c/silver/issues. And if you have the time, become a member. You can join this work by joining the community group, w3.org/community/silver. And I'm going to go to questions, but I'm going to leave this slide up so that the URLs are on my screen a little longer. Laura.
Thanks, Wilco. Let's go ahead and dive into it. So I think you kind of covered this when you were talking about WCAG 3.0 and protocols, but does WCAG plan on including email accessibility in the future? This person uses many of the best practices in their work, but they haven't seen any standards specific to email.
Email does largely use web technologies, so I think it very well could. This may be one of those things that a protocol could fit in really well, or potentially a standalone module just to address email accessibility. There are ways to do that, and I've not seen an issue raised, so maybe look on GitHub to see if anybody's brought this up yet. I think that's an interesting idea.
Awesome, thank you. Moving on, so the lack of AA prefers reduced motion hurts this person, and they've set their OS that they don't want animation. Why is that not been enacted in some of the W3C decisions?
I can't say I know the answer to that.
Mm.
The scope of WCAG 2 was being decided a number of years ago. I don't know how prominent prefers reduced motion was at that time.
Mm.
I don't think it was in standard yet. I am sure it'll be picked up. No doubt somebody will bring this up for 3.0.
Awesome. Thank you. So will WCAG 2.1 be considered redundant as soon as 2.2 is released? How will the 2.2 release kind of impact what's already been out in the field?
So no, WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 are still very much relevant, and lots of organizations use them. They're embedded in standards and legislation, and by all means continue to use them. If you are in an opportunity to migrate over to 2.2, by all means do so. Definitely use the latest version. That has been a recommendation. Just wait just a little bit until we've made it to recommendation. But we'll get there soon. And at that point, please do consider upgrading. But if it's in legislation, but no, 2.0, 2.1 are not going away anytime soon. It took actually, I think it was last year that WCAG 1.0 was officially, I don't want to say deprecated. I think it was deprecated.
Great, thanks, Wilco.
Standards are there for a long time.
Right. So last question here. I know there's a ton in the chat. Feel free to reach out to Wilco again offline. But the last question is asking if a website is WCAG 3.0 Silver compliant, will that automatically mean it's compliant to WCAG 2.2 AA? So kind of just asking about how like WCAG 3.0 will kind of map to WCAG 2.2.
We don't know yet. Likely it for a very, very large portion will be. But things may change, and the working group didn't want to constrain itself. So one of the things that you might see go away is the 4.1.1 parsing requirement, for example. There might be some things like that go away or that get reduced in scope.
Well, thanks so much. I know you wanted to save some time here after the questions to make a brief statement, so I'll let you go ahead and move into that.
Thank you, Laura. And this is a difficult one. And by all means, if you are not up for this subject, feel free to drop off. I want to touch just briefly on disability and the war in Ukraine. I'll give everybody just a second to do that if they need to, because this is a heavy subject. So, as I'm sure we all know, currently there's a terrible war going on in Ukraine, and there's a lot of suffering. In particular, the war is impacting people with disabilities. War is when the most vulnerable suffer the most. People are running out of medication. Of essential medication, especially people with disabilities, will struggle and suffer because of this. Bomb shelters are often not wheelchair accessible, and so people are stuck in their homes while bombs are falling around them. And people in institutions are at risk of abandonment. Their caretakers are often leaving. They're fleeing, they're taking their families to safety, and you cannot blame people for taking their children to safety. But people with disabilities are being abandoned. And it's a terrible nightmare what's happening there. And if nothing else, I want to ask that you all visit European Disability Forum's website. They've put up a page on EDF www.feph.org/Ukraine. You can find news there and information on what people with disabilities are going through in Ukraine right now. And I have some suggestions on how to help. And if nothing else, I just hope you'll take a look. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wilco, for sharing that very helpful resource. I really hope that people check that out, and I really appreciate you bringing light to this in this difficult moment. And thank you so much. I just want to thank you again. Really great presentation, and I hope everybody does check out this resource and has a great rest of their AXCON.
Thank you, Laura.